And today I'm very confident in saying that we absolutely changed public opinion and brought awareness to the MSP profession. But with that comes responsibility, right? With great power comes great responsibility. I think Voltaire may have said that. Very true for the MSPs. Now that so much attention, so much power and influence has been granted to the MSPs, now comes the accountability portion. And that's where Enron comes into play. I don't want an MSP out there, any MSP by themselves or in the aggregate, being accused of having an Enron moment. And so that's what this episode is really about. It's trying to educate and inform all of you. It's Cybersecurity Awareness Month right now, so it's an appropriately themed topic and question to pose. But I don't want anything negative like an Enron moment impacting our profession. Has cybersecurity reached its Enron moment? That's a big question. We're going to have to unpack that, explain a little bit about what Enron meant in the context of financial audit, corporate governance, because it actually has a lot to do with what we're seeing right now in the cybersecurity space, including in the managed services profession. Now, some of you may be saying, who's Enron? Is that a new cybersecurity company? No, we'll explain it shortly. But Enron was a company in the late 90s that grew to prominence and eventually became, I believe, one of the largest energy companies in the United States at the time. And what happened to Enron is, while unfortunate, it taught us a lot about what was going on, and it highlighted things that needed to be fixed. And I'll tell you right up front, I don't know if that Enron moment has happened already with the cybersecurity industry or if it's about to happen. But I sense that there are still some, if it has happened, there are still some things that have yet to be fully resolved and adopted across the fruited plain, as it were. So my sense is that we may not yet have had our moment. But if that's true, then I certainly would want this podcast episode to serve as some sort of warning or some sort of preventative measure that we all could use to guard against a negative outcome from a cybersecurity Enron type of moment. So let's just dive right in and I'll explain exactly what I'm thinking. So to understand what Enron meant, right? I'll take you back to the to this time period. So this is post .com era, post Y2K, and Enron was, I think they were based in Texas, maybe in Houston, but doesn't really matter. They were a U.S. energy company, and they were a very big, I think the biggest at the time, energy company. The Enron scandal, basically, Enron declared bankruptcy, as did their accounting firm, Arthur Henderson, at the time. So this was a fairly significant moment where you had a very large publicly traded company that was, up until that moment, according to everybody, including the people at Enron, a very well-run organization. They were making a ton of money, according to them, according to their audit partner. And that was not the case. It ended up being that the company, Enron, was actually in quite poor financial performance. They had misrepresented a lot of their financial numbers and data, and it actually ended up being that they were very much in debt. They weren't profitable. They weren't making as much money as they claimed to be. And so it caused the downfall of this very big energy company, this very big publicly traded company. And their accounting firm, Arthur Andersen, also eventually dissolved as a result of it. People went to jail. There were a lot of investigations. There were congressional hearings, and eventually it led to a number of public policy changes, including a fairly significant law in the United States called Sarbanes-Oxley. And so that's what Enron's about, right? Go read up more on the sort of details if you want to learn more about it, but that's a good high level synopsis. What does that have to do with cybersecurity, and what does that have to do with managed service providers. Well, I'll tell you how it involves MSPs right now. MSPs are under increasing scrutiny, not because of wrongdoing, but because the MSPs are everywhere. MSPs have so much power and influence today compared to even 10 years ago that it is unavoidable for people in power, people who legislate, to deal with the MSP issue. They always are running into MSPs because that's who controls much of internal IT. It controls much of the security status of small and mid-sized organizations, and there's just no way around it. And I'll take a pause there and kind of reorient all of you to 25 years ago, 30 years ago. MSPs would come to me and say, "Hey, Charles, what can MSP Alliance do to bring greater notoriety for the MSP profession? Because nobody understands what we do." Well, we didn't act alone. We didn't do it by ourselves. But I'll take significant credit for the MSP Alliance that we led the charge early on when nobody else was out there. We led the charge to bring attention and bring standards and best practices attention to the managed services profession. And today I'm very confident saying that we absolutely changed public opinion and brought awareness to the MSP profession. But with that comes responsibility, right? With great power comes great responsibility. I think Voltaire may have said that. Very true for the MSPs. Now that so much attention, so much power and influence has been granted to the MSPs, now comes the accountability portion. And that's where Enron comes into play. I don't want an MSP out there, any MSP by themselves or in the aggregate, being accused of having an Enron moment. And so that's what this episode is really about. It's trying to educate and inform all of you. It's Cybersecurity Awareness Month right now, so it's an appropriately themed topic and question to pose. But I don't want anything negative like an Enron moment impacting our profession. We have too much at stake. We have too much opportunity. And so that's why I'm raising this question. So let's take now that you understand the Enron backdrop and analogy, let's now take a look at the last 3 to 5 years and see what we've been facing from a cybersecurity standpoint. And we all know this is not new. This is not revelation information, right? Billions and billions of dollars have been spent and are being spent right now on security. Everybody knows this. And the amount of money, the magnitude of the amount of money being spent, still we have attacks. Probably will always have attacks, but we have more successful attacks than we probably need. And we have more successful attacks that end up in very debilitating and very negative consequences, meaning there are attacks on very resilient organizations and there are attacks on not so resilient organizations. And that more than not ends up being the critical question, right? Not are you going to be attacked? Everyone's going to be attacked. Is it going to be successful? And how quickly and how resilient are you as an organization to get back up on your feet? So with all this money being spent, you still have very significant, very public, very noteworthy incidents, data breaches, or loss of data or loss of money, or both, involving very large organizations. I'm not going to list all of them, but Google, MGM Resorts, Capital One, and on have all been attacked. And it doesn't mean that they're bad companies. It just means that we have a very big issue of enterprise, mid-market, and small, mid-sized organizations alike. Everybody has the same goal here, or should have the same goal. And why are we spending all this money and yet we still have, I would argue, and others would argue as well, probably less than desirable outcomes for all of that money being spent? I'll give you a couple of my rationale for and reasons for why I think that we're having a negative outcome or a poor return on investment. Fragmented defenses, fragmented IT, fragmented cybersecurity defenses, poor governance in general. That would be, lack of oversight, internal oversight and external oversight. You could call the lack of internal oversight just an apathy for executive leadership and people in power to be able to know what's going on with their organization's cybersecurity and IT spend and know what's going on and being accountable for that. That was one of the biggest takeaways from Enron, right? Is that the people that were indicted, the people that went to jail were people who should have known in their corporation what was going on. And they said, well, I think they claimed, all of them, well, I really didn't know what was going on. But that didn't save them, right? They went to jail nonetheless, and they paid, all of them, I think, fairly hefty fines. But this claim, this statement of, oh, I don't know what's going on in my cybersecurity division. I don't pay attention to that. I'm just the CEO. I'm just the CFO, or I'm the COO. Those are not very good arguments anymore. In fact, those are arguments that nobody should be making. And that's why you want and need to have executive buy-in, executive leadership, and executive accountability for not just your financial statements to comply with things like Sarbanes-Oxley and other corporate governance rules and best practices, but you also want the same thing, that executive buy-in for cybersecurity. Because we're heading to that moment, if we're not already there, based on a patchwork quilt of cybersecurity legislation that already exists, and more is coming, but we already have enough that everyone listening to this should pay attention and make some reasonable change in your organization. That saying I didn't know is not an excuse. It's not going to save you. It's not. You're going to be held to account based off of what the best practice is, not based off of what you did. And a claim that, oh, I did as well as I could have. I didn't know I was going to get attacked by whomever. Those days are gone. And so how does this impact MSPs? The MSPs are impacted in one critical way, which is these fragmented defenses. MSPs inherit these, right? When they take on a new managed services customer, they often, I know this because I talk to a lot of MSPs, and they say this one thing over and over again. We come across a lot of new customers, and they come across a lot of Wild West, non-structured, very poor cybersecurity. And it's up to the MSP to kind of raise the bar and set things right. It's like a new sheriff coming to town and just whipping the law and order into shape, right? Getting rid of all the stuff that used to happen and making a clean break moving forward. And that's why MSPs play such a critical role. But MSPs also have a fair amount of responsibility now in that new role that they're playing. I'd like to next shift with a more concrete example of this kind of Enron analogy. And I'm not suggesting that the company involved here is an Enron, but there's a very notable case a couple of years ago that involved SolarWinds, a very good company, make great products, right? We're big supporters of the company, but they had a moment that everybody knows about. And it involved a cybersecurity attack that was successful. The Security and Exchange Commission thought that it was a noteworthy enough event that they charged this SolarWinds chief information security officer for misleading their investors about the security risks of how the company was handling internal security. A fairly big thing to happen. Now, yes, they are a publicly traded company. They have a slightly different exposure to this type of risk, and therefore they have and still do, compared to privately held companies, different reporting and disclosure requirements. But I don't think that those disclosure requirements aside, I don't think that absolves privately held companies from behaving any differently. I think privately held companies have a great responsibility. Now, even though they're privately held, there are many, many laws that, I don't want to say make them like or similar to a public company, but in terms of cybersecurity, there are very, very few significant differences between public-private companies. For financial reporting, very different. But for private held companies, I think that there's a great amount of similarity between any entity, public or private, in terms of how you should be handling cybersecurity defense and transparency and accountability. Accountability is critical here. And so, the SolarWinds attack, not only did it impact our industry because of the amount of MSPs who do use, even to this day, companies like SolarWinds, it just highlights this idea that executive C-suite buy-in, corporate governance has to be involved. They have to be made aware of. And in fact, there's no area where they can hide and say, I didn't know. They are ultimately responsible. And that is the standard of care that we are now all facing. We all fall under that standard of care. There is no place to hide to say, well, I didn't know that the threat landscape was that bad. I didn't know that we weren't complying with best practice because we failed to turn on multi-factor authentication or back up our data or do any of the other things that they should have been doing. Those excuses don't exist anymore. And that's also kind of that Enron analogy where, and this is especially true for MSP leadership, but it's really true for customer leadership. MSP customers can't use this excuse, and they can't use the excuse, I will add here, of saying, well, I thought my MSP was handling that, right? That excuse is not going to fly. I've seen that excuse in litigation, and that is not working. That is certainly not a best practice. Executives, even those who outsource to MSPs, cannot just simply say, I thought my MSP was doing this. Now, that's a much bigger issue, but I want to be very careful and very emphatic here that the role that MSPs play as outsourced IT and security professionals does bring a certain transfer of risk from that organization, shifting it to the MSP. But it doesn't shift all of their risk. It doesn't shift all of their responsibility to the MSP. It can't and it never will. So I just want to be very clear about that I am not talking about a wholesale indemnification by the MSP of their client. That is not what we're talking about. That's not what managed services best practices, and it's certainly not what the rest of the world believes to be the case. I mentioned some of the regulatory changes that we're seeing drive accountability here. Back to this Enron comparison, there's certainly for public companies, there's a lot of Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, rules. There's a cybersecurity disclosure rule for SEC covered entities. You have Europe acting very aggressively in terms of similar types of data privacy, data integrity, disclosure requirements all throughout Europe, not just starting with GDPR, but including NIS2, and the UK is following suit with a lot of these European regulatory activities. The UK is very much following suit, same with Australia, New Zealand, etc. You have also in Europe DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, which is again further evidence of Europe's pursuit of something similar to what we have in federal and state legislation here in the US and in Canada for a national critical infrastructure sector like financial services, banking, etc. We've said this many times here, but the impact to the MSPs of all this is as follows. Compliance is no longer an option. It is no longer a boutique service line for very vertical specific MSPs. Every MSP, I don't care if you are a general practitioner, if all of you do is managed services in the greater Punxsutawney region, you are still covered by a multitude of different compliance regulations, some state, some federal, maybe even some international, depending on who your customers are. But you cannot operate in this bubble and say, I only practice in a small town. I don't have to worry about any of that. My customers don't have to worry about that. Not true. Not true anymore. What do we want? If we don't want to have an Enron moment, if we don't want to have another big cybersecurity event that just tips the scales in the favor of public outcry that says, enough is enough. We want change and we want change now. And somebody suggests some harebrained scheme, and then that harebrained scheme becomes a law, right? That's typically how things happen. The greater the severity, the greater the complexity of and the overreach in what happens next, right? For all the good that Sarbanes did, it brought an incredible amount of bureaucracy and an incredible amount of cost to running a public company. And, I think for everybody that could say that Sarbanes was a good law, you have a fair number of people also saying it has some downsides as well. And maybe that's true with life. But the goal here is if we are in a pre-cybersecurity Enron moment, then we still have time to change. We still have the opportunity to change the future and not really allow what could be to happen. That kind of sounds like an Avengers movie plot, but you get what I'm saying, right? What needs to change? Starting with the MSP, executive leadership, but applying absolutely to the managed services customer. Boards of directors and executives have to be made aware and must be told, because that they are accountable for everything that happens in the organization from a cybersecurity standpoint. They must be involved. Get them involved. MSPs, this is a direct challenge to you. Get your MSP customers, your managed services customers, get them involved and stop the excuses. I know you get these excuses. Believe me, I know you've been fighting this for many, many years, some of you, a lot of you, where the owner of the company just says, I'm not going to really worry about that because you got that, right? You're my MSP. You're going to handle all that risk, that cyber risk stuff, right? No, you can't handle all of it. There has to be buy-in. There has to be involvement from the customer executive level that says, I'm aware of the risk, I'm aware of what you're telling me, and I'm aware of what I need to do in order to prevent it. And I'm aware that you as my MSP, although you don't, you have my best interest at heart, I know that you're not actually part of my company. I actually have to take responsibility for what goes on in my organization, and you as my MSP are going to help me do that. That is a better relationship. That is a relationship where the MSP is actually enabling, is fulfilling the ability for that customer C-suite to become involved and effective in driving cybersecurity change in their organization. Until that happens, you're going to have not only very negative returns on the cybersecurity investment made, but you're also going to have a very big gap between what the MSP thinks is going on and what the customer thinks is going on. And that is, I don't know if I'm sure someone has done an analogy or a study of what happened at Enron and how the Arthur Andersen, auditors were helping bury the truth, bury the data that showed what was really happening at Enron instead of what was being told to the public was happening. And I would never want that to ever happen between an MSP and a managed services customer. If it came out during litigation, if it came out in some other way, that there was a big gap between those two organizations, because that's where bad things can happen, when there's daylight between those two entities. They have to be acting as one, as a single unit, with the MSP taking on the appropriate amount of risk and helping their customer effectively mitigate the remaining risk. Not all of it can be pushed aside, like I said, but a fair amount of it can be handled. The sheer number of MSPs that we see in the certification program who are now actively getting involved in compliance related issues with their customers is, again, one of these undeniable truths that is, a fairly small fraction of the market is currently doing it well. It's going to be the type of thing that, in 5 years, everybody's going to be doing it. Mark my words. When I say compliance, when I say a managed services company is getting involved in compliance, I do not mean they are reselling a GRC tool. That is the worst example of an MSP becoming involved in compliance. That is not what I'm talking about. I am talking about a managed service provider actively, constructively being involved with their customer to say to the customer, here's what we're doing for you right now. Here's what we should be doing for you. This is what we would like to see from you. This is what we can do, but this is what you must do. And combining those two elements, whether or not it achieves a certification outcome, an audit outcome, like a SOC 2, or whether it's just the MSP helping the customer fill out that cybersecurity insurance form that they desperately need. Otherwise, they're going to have their cyber coverage dropped, right? All of those things implicate compliance. If it's the Texas safe harbor law that just went into effect last September, and it's an MSP, anywhere dealing with a Texas company, trying to get them to a place where they won't be subject to punitive damages in any type of civil litigation, that's also a form of compliance, right? Has nothing to do with reselling a GRC tool. It's much deeper than that. That's where MSPs are heading. That is the MSP of the future. And that MSP is no longer running cable, running Ethernet cable under the floorboards, trying to connect printers and mapping networks. They will still do that. They will still do those things. But that's going to be the commodity. That's going to be the low-hanging fruit. That's going to be the stuff that becomes kind of table stakes for any MSP. But where the MSP will shine, where they will make money. Yes, you can make money doing this, and you should be, because it's valuable. It's damned valuable. Where the MSP of the future is going to make money and become even more influential and earn, again, the moniker of trusted partner is going to be in shifting from the IT room and IT role into the compliance, cybersecurity position as advisor. And that, my friends, is located in the executive suite. You have arrived. If there is a positive thing to take away from all of this, for those MSPs who are following what I just said and doing those things, you have arrived. There is no higher position of authority. I would argue even the CEO wouldn't be this influential in an organization. An MSP who has this level of influence and power to be able to advocate and implement positive cybersecurity change to help that organization, you are more valuable than you realize if you can do that. And that would be worth everything. There's no price for that. There is no rush to the bottom in terms of commodity pricing, where if you're one of these MSPs and you're frustrated about the MSP across town is trying to play footsie with your customer and offering to do the same thing that you do for 5% less. Not going to happen in this scenario. No one's going to be coming into the executive suite and saying, "Oh, I'm going to advise you and become your cybersecurity advisor, and I'm going to do it for 5%, 10% less than the other guy." Those are not conversations we're going to have. Sorry. Make the change. Make the shift. Become that critical advisor to your customers. Don't just sit at the tech stack and think that you are insulated from future competition. In fact, you have to be actively moving right now, or you will become irrelevant very, very quick. How do we avoid this cybersecurity Enron moment from happening? Again, I'll summarize. MSPs need to stay aware, become very well versed on the compliance issues and laws and policies impacting all of their customers. They have to begin to retrofit their service line with effective, current, up-to-date technologies that will help protect their customers. They must engage with their customer in a more meaningful way. They must help enable their customer to become more cyber resilient, to become more transparent themselves, to prevent against that type of Enron accusation of, "Well, I didn't know." A managed services customer who is engaged, getting the right services from that MSP, should never have to say, I didn't know. They should be the ones that say, I knew exactly what was going on. We were prepared. And even if you were successfully attacked, as more and more laws like this Texas Safe Harbor law come into action, more and more defenses are going to be sounding like this. We did everything we were supposed to do. We did this, 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 and this. We got attacked. Part of it was successful. This is now why it was successful. This is how we are now changing. But we did everything that we could have done at that moment. We were just outgunned. And don't think that what I'm saying is going to stop successful breaches from happening. And that's not what I'm saying. What we're saying is we're going to make the bad guys fight for every yard. Don't give them an inch. Don't make it easier than it already is. Make it tougher. Make it so tough that it becomes economically difficult and expensive for the bad guys to try to get in at all. That's when we'll see the tide change in this cyber war. And that will stave off any type of Enron cybersecurity moment from happening in the future, is having more transparency, being more upfront, getting executive buy-in from customers and MSPs alike, so that everybody is actively aware of what's happening, what the threats are, and what is being done to defend against them and to become resilient against those attacks should they be successful. If you follow those steps, we can win this. And if you follow these steps, you MSPs out there listening to this, you will remain dominant, you will remain in demand, you will remain influential, and you will remain trusted. That's how we win this. Stay safe. Until next time.